So Dune Awakening is an upcoming survival MMO, and a lot of people have had the sentiment that it's going to primarily be a survival game with some MMO elements added on top. But I think the development of this game is actually going to be a lot more inspired by more old school MMOs than a lot of people realize. And with that in mind, I want to go over the potential crafting systems we could see in Dune Awakening. Now, we haven't actually gotten a ton of specific information on a lot of the different crafting elements, but because of some of the inspirations for the developers making Dune Awakening and some of the bits of information we've gotten, I think we can actually get a pretty good idea of the crafting elements. And one of the reasons I actually want to make this video is because some of the developers did mention that Star Wars Galaxies was a pretty big inspiration for some of the elements. Now, Star Wars Galaxies is a heavily revered MMO. A lot of the developers that have made some of the most popular and most successful MMOs have actually had Star Wars Galaxies as one of their big inspirations. And I think one of the big elements of Star Wars Galaxies that's going to be applicable to Dune Awakening is their crafting system. Because Star Wars Galaxies was much more of a sandbox MMO with a very big player-driven economy, and their crafting system was extremely deep, but also very complex. You can even go look up some YouTube videos of people explaining the crafting systems, and you need like 20-minute guides just to understand the basics. And that was actually a pretty big intent of Star Wars Galaxies because crafting was such a big element. And back then, having very deep and complex systems like this was a very big element of MMOs. And I think we'll definitely see some inspirations from that going into Dune Awakening. Now, at a base, we know Dune Awakening is going to have a pretty big focus on both crafting and building, which are going to be two systems that intermingle. You'll be crafting a lot of items that are used in the building process. And we know that both of these systems are also going to be sharing a bunch of the different resources. And that's all something you would normally expect from a survival game. Even going to something like Conan Exiles, you have a lot of these similar systems, but I would also expect there to be some more depth in the different items you're actually able to craft, not only just because an MMO usually has a lot more items in a lot more systems, so you would need your crafting system to have more depth and a lot more width, but because you're also going to have a player-driven economy with a marketplace, which is absolutely going to play very heavily into the crafting systems. Now, I think the best place to start is with recipes and blueprints because we've gotten some very interesting information on these. And to start off, we have the building system, which is going to be intermingled with the crafting system. They're going to be sharing a bunch of resources. You're probably going to be using different crafting systems to make or augment different building pieces. And then you also have the blueprinting system that's going to play a bit into this as well, where you can fully build a base, then you can blueprint the entirety of that base, and you can go trade that to other players or put it on the market and sell it. So someone could buy that blueprint from you, place down this full hologram base, then just put the resources into all of these different elements and have the exact same base that you sold them. And as this is going to be a survival game, you're also going to be making crafting benches and other crafting elements. So crafting is going to play a pretty big part in the base building and base blueprinting system, which is also going to feed back into the player-driven economy. But the blueprint system is seeming to be even more interesting. And just a small disclaimer, I don't know exactly what they're going to name these different elements. We do know that blueprinting is specifically being talked about for the building system. So you blueprint a base, then can sell that. But I'm not exactly sure what they're going to be calling recipes or the things you learn to be able to craft new items, such as weapons or armors. Presumably, it's going to be recipes or schematic or something similar to that. So the specific naming may change. But the way you go about obtaining some of these recipes is just incredibly interesting. Now, at a base, you're presumably going to be getting a lot of base crafting recipes, maybe through a talent tree or a skill tree, kind of like you did in Conan Exiles. But following what a lot of other survival games have done, you're probably just going to be getting those base recipes that allow you to craft the most basic things. But to get a lot of the more intricate, more rare, and more unique craftable items, you're going to be obtaining recipes from anywhere in the world. So you go find a point of interest, maybe there's a boss there you kill or a chest you loot, and you can find a specific recipe from that maybe you can craft a new weapon. But when you add this element into the deep desert zone, this is where it gets very interesting. If you don't know what the deep desert zone is, this is going to be a pretty large section of the overall map. This is going to be the place that PvP is always enabled. This is where you and your clans or your friends are going to go to fight for the most valuable resources. But the deep desert zone is reset on a weekly basis from the Coriolis storms, and this is going to be a system where a storm comes through and resets all of these areas and changes all of these areas using some amount of procedural generation. So maybe a bunch of points of interest that were there last week are going to be covered with sand next week and you won't be able to access them. Or maybe a storm comes through one area and removes a bunch of sand, and now there's a new point of interest, so a new place to explore and a new loot to obtain. But when you add in recipes to the system, it gets very interesting, because let's say there's one point of interest that has maybe a somewhat rare recipe that you can only get from that point of interest. And let's say you as a player goes there and finds that rare recipe that allows you to make a new pistol. But then let's say next week the Coriolis storm comes through and that point of interest is now gone, and maybe that point of interest won't be reintroduced until a few weeks down the road. And let's say since that recipe was pretty rare, it ends up being a really good pistol with some stats that a lot of players want. And let's say on your overarching server, you're the only person that got that rare pistol when it was available, and it's not going to be available for a week or 2 weeks down the road. So for those couple weeks, you could legitimately be the only person on that overarching server that can make and sell those pistols. So what you could do is focus that entire week on gathering all the resources to craft a bunch of these pistols and constantly put them all up on the player bazaar, which is the player marketplace, and just make a ridiculous amount of money doing that. And that's going to be something that's possible in Dune Awakening, because Dune Awakening is also going to have a lot of those sandbox elements. So things like this are actually going to be possible and probably pretty viable. And because of the nature of the Coriolis storm system and the deep desert areas where they're somewhat procedurally generated, it may actually be really hard to get the information on where specific recipes are. Because obviously these days there's YouTube videos or guides for pretty much everything. But depending on how quickly people find these things, it may not actually be quick enough for a lot of people to go obtain them before a new Coriolis storm comes in and wipes out those areas and procedurally generates other points of interest. So there's actually going to be lots of opportunities for you or a handful of people to be able to corner a market or corner the market on specific items, which in my opinion is one of the most interesting parts of sandbox games. Having these kind of niche possibilities to have a pretty large impact on your overarching server. Now, looking past recipes and blueprints and looking a bit more into the actual crafting systems themselves, we've gotten a few pieces of information that gives us a little bit of a glimpse into what we could actually expect, because some of the developers have mentioned some of the different things you'll be able to craft. So you'll be able to craft weapons, armor, tools, and then you'll even be able to craft vehicles. So you'll be able to craft the land vehicles, some of the vehicles that kind of look like tanks, and you'll be able to craft all of the flying vehicles. But not only are you just going to be able to craft all these different items, you're also going to be able to customize all of these different things you can craft. So let's say you want to go craft a base ornithopter to be able to fly around and scout out all the different zones of Dune Awakening. But then let's say you're trying to transport a spice harvester. Maybe it's one of the very big ones, or maybe it's a really small one, but you want to be able to transport it on your ornithopter to a very far away area. And this is the main way you'd be able to get the spice harvester there. So what it sounds like you're going to be able to do is take that ornithopter and customize it, and let's say either craft an augment to put on it, or just directly craft on the ornithopter that puts a new part on it that allows it to pick up and transport certain sizes of vehicles. And when you expand that out to all of the other crafting elements, so weapons, armor, ground vehicles, flying vehicles, and every other crafting element you could think of, this has the potential to add a ridiculous amount of depth to a crafting system. And taking it back to one of these developers' inspirations, which was Star Wars Galaxies. Star Wars Galaxies crafting systems are incredibly deep, but pretty much every item you can craft in Star Wars Galaxies has a bunch of different elements you can basically experiment on or use different resources on to change its stats in different ways or augment the outcome. Now, I don't think Dune Awakening is going to be that complex, but taking some of those inspirations and adding them into a more survival driven game, and you can have some ridiculous customization. This could be everything from completely augmenting a weapon to give it different attachments, or changing the range of the weapon, or changing the damage and making it do different damage types, to even completely augmenting your armor or even your still suits. Maybe you have one still suit that you're able to move much quicker in, but it doesn't hold as much water. Or maybe you have a much more bulky still suit that makes you tankier and you'd be able to hold more water in it, but you're much slower at moving around. Then you could even get into things like personal shields or shielding against different types of damage. But adding in all of these different elements, it's definitely going to be a pretty deep crafting system. And another element that adds into this is that the developers of Dune Awakening have been very adamant that you're going to be able to play Dune Awakening in pretty much, they've even specifically mentioned that if you're somebody that just wants to go gather resources and craft items and sell them on the market, that you would legitimately be able to do that. That would be the main thing you do. You're not someone that likes going out and doing combat against players or doing any of that stuff. All you want to do is be the best crafter possible. That is going to be a possibility in Dune Awakening. And with the developers wanting this to be a possibility, this means that they would have to be developing systems to give all of these different types of players deep and interesting systems. And a crafting system in a survival game where somebody could focus 100% of their playtime on it is definitely a worthwhile goal. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.